Welcome to the Braided Funding webinar brought to you by Thomas P. Miller and Associates. My name is Andrea Hutchins. I am Vice President at Thomas P. Miller and Associates, and I am really excited to be joined here this morning by Dawn Busick, who is a Senior Director at TPMA, Brett Weiler, who is Director of Economic Development at TPMA, and Dr. Joanna Anderson, whose title I wrote down so I did not pronounce it wrong. She is the President of State Fair Community College. So thank you for joining us this morning. So just a little bit of background on why we're here and what you can expect this morning. So braided funding is kind of a new term for some. For others, it's a fancier way of saying putting together multiple pots of money from different sources. For some folks, I realize it's a little bit intimidating. And at TPMA, as you can imagine, we're a 32-year-old consulting firm that does a lot of work with different industries. And one of the things that we are constantly hearing about right now is the intimidation factor when it comes to the American Rescue Plan, some of the federal funds that are out there outside of the American Rescue Plan funds, state funding, local funding. How do you use those funds? How can you expand opportunities? And so, we try as often as possible to respond to questions that we're hearing on a pretty consistent basis from our clients. And this is one that does seem to be causing a lot of, we'll just call it heartburn. So I also know that in addition to the intimidation factor, some folks are always looking for ways to use funds creatively. And I think we've done a pretty good job with the help of one of our team members who is, I see in the audience, but not on the call. And I do want to give him a quick shout out, Reagan Walsh, who is also a recently joined employee at Thomas P. Miller Associates, graduate of KU Rock Chalk. So he was instrumental in helping us put together this presentation. So I want to give him a little bit of a shout out as well. So we do have a pretty tight agenda, I think, for today, but just some housekeeping items that I want to make sure that we share with the audience. Brett and Dawn are going to be kind of answering some of the initial questions. Dr. Anderson, if there is something that is extremely interesting to you and you want to chime in, feel free to do so. But Dr. Anderson is going to be going over a really interesting case study here midway through the webinar today. And so we're really excited to hear from her in that regard. We will be taking questions from the audience, but we are going to get a couple of key questions out the door first. And then after Dr. Anderson's presentation, we'll be taking and answering some of those questions. If you want to ask a question before that, feel free to just add it to the chat. But I don't want you to think that we're ignoring you when I save it for the end. And then just the final item of housekeeping is that we will be recording this entire webinar, and it will be up on our YouTube, as are most of our webinars. So if one of your friends or neighbors didn't get to join and they're finance dorks like we are, then maybe you can pass it their way. So, okay, well, we will go ahead and get things kicked off. So my very first question, I mentioned before that braided funding is really just kind of a fancy term, if you will, for pooling together different pots of money. I'd love to hear Dawn and Brett, since you are kind of in different industries. Dawn, for those of you who don't know, has a workforce education background. Brett is more economic development. What does braided funding mean to you?
So I will start. And so in the world of workforce development or higher ed, both of these industries rely upon grant funding. So when we've been doing braided funding for many, many years in these industries, in so much that many grants require match, and that's local match to federal dollars. So it's a blended funded project. So much comes from the Fed, so much comes from the state or the locals. But that's kind of how it works in the world of grant. The other thing in the world of the public workforce system, where they share facilities with key stakeholder partners, mandatory partners that need to be inside their American job centers, is there's cost sharing of resources. And so that's also blended funding type projects. We've been doing it for years, but we're getting better. And now with the onslaught of all this money coming for a rapid recovery across the country, we're getting better at that. Brett?
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. And so I guess with my experience in economic development, I look at it a little bit differently. For me, it's all about an approach, and the approach for economic development practitioners needs to be recognizing and utilizing the full scope of economic development finance tools that are available to them. And I can talk about those tools maybe in a little bit more detail further in discussion, but there's a couple key categories when we're talking about these economic development finance tools. One, what I call bedrock tools. These are typically bonds, general obligation bonds, private activity bonds, kind of the foundation of economic development finance. We also have targeted tools. So those are typically value capture tools or special assessment tools. So when I say value capture, I'm talking about tax increment financing or similar type districts and tools that capture incremental value for projects. And then special assessment districts, so business improvement districts, key innovation zones, different assessment tools that can be put back into projects. Third category, investment tools. These are tax credits and incentives. So new market tax credits, historic tax credits, opportunity zones. Some states have film creation credits, enterprise zone credits. Those are typically what we refer to as investment tools. Fourth, access to capital tools. So these are loans, venture funds, fund of funds. Funds of funds support economic development organizations who have revolving loan funds or micro loan funds for end users, businesses, or developers. And then lastly, federal support tools. And those are sort of a wraparound tool for all different economic development projects. But you're talking about key agencies like the SBA, the EDA, USDA, any number of federal agencies that provide different tools for specific projects. So to summarize, I think braided funding is all about an approach and making sure you're utilizing all of the different types of finance tools available to you.
Well, it sounds like there are just a few out there. And so one of the benefits, I think, of having webinars like this, and even, I guess maybe a silver lining of COVID, is that groups that have traditionally been siloed, so workforce, education, and economic development, are really starting to work together. And so I think that a lot of people are seeing more opportunity for braided funding. But Brett, some of those terms that you just used, I can guarantee you, for people who are not involved in economic development, they probably think that you're speaking Greek. So anyway, so I think it's really important that we have events like this and kind of talk about one another's vernacular and the fact that these tools aren't off limits to people in the education workforce space, right? So this is good. So speaking of kind of maybe some misunderstandings or some opportunities for miscommunication, braided funding in general seems to be kind of an area that can invoke fear depending on what your role is within an organization. I am sure that you all have worked with a number of auditors and finance people, many of them whom I am still friends with, that I have worked with, who just, whenever you talk about braiding funds together, their spidey senses, go all over the place. So when people talk about being afraid of braiding funds, Don, what are your thoughts as far as like kind of calming those fears and helping them to see that this is actually a positive and not something that they should shy away from?
Sure. The first thing is trusting your community or your state leader, your partners that come to the table for the common good of the region or the state, or just maybe a couple county community. But it is trust and understanding that we all it's through distributed leadership. We all come to the table with gifts, and that's time, resources, and funds. And funds are key. Especially when I've always considered workforce development and education part of economic development. They can't do it without us. In fact, workforce development is the number one priority on every EDC and local chambers initiative. We can, attract companies to come and build, and we can build roads, but we need the skilled workforce. And we can't have the skilled workforce without our colleges and our higher education and those career tech ed programs. So It's a matter of having civility rules around the table. We all come together with a common project and having trust.
Go ahead,
Andrew,
Brett.
if I could build on that a little bit, I love the word trust there. I think it's so important. I would throw another one out there, and that's partnership, right? In my experience, representatives from federal agencies, state agencies, they want to help you, right? They want to put this money to work. They want to see it go to good projects. They want to mitigate your stress on the reporting and the tracking and all of that. So, I think approach it as a partnership with the agency. Reach out to them early and often and ensure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. They are there to help you. I would also emphasize too, though, it does require strong administrative support within your agency, right? You have to have systems in place. You have to have that strong back office infrastructure to manage the reporting and the tracking. So I don't want to gloss over that, but if you have that infrastructure in place and you approach it as a partnership with your funder, I think you're going to be set up for success.
I'd like to add to that, Andrea. You're absolutely right, Brett. And so much that when you create partnership projects, it's always good to have the strong administrative background, but also to have like an executive advisory board representative of all those partners, helping that administrative back office make some maybe hard decisions and to ensure that the project's on time and all the deliverables are met. If we have a partner for some reason that's falling behind, the rest of us come together, because you have to go into this with, if one fails, we all fail. So having that executive advisory assisting the administrative support really makes it a win-win for all.
Don, I think during conversations when we were preparing for this event, I think you mentioned that there is often a natural kind of leader that comes out of that executive board. And what I mean by that is not necessarily a leader that's a person, but an organization. Can you talk a little bit about like what that might look like and who that leadership group might be?
Yeah, so most definitely, because we're talking funds and a variety of different types of fund, federal, state, local, public, private, you need to have a strong fiduciary agent. So typically the leading organization is the one that has the most advanced financial systems in place that they can handle moving money from partners and paying bills on projects. The other thing you need to give consideration to, who has the broadest legal authority to do so. So like at state agencies, when we go into states and we see states doing braided funded projects, they will look at their legislative authority, their legal authority of what they can and can't do. So typically agencies like a Department of Economic Development or a Department of Commerce, they have pretty broad legal authority. They do community block grants, they can do workforce development. Another one would be Department of Transportation. They do an extensive amount of work. They can move earth and dirt, build buildings, roads. And so they have a broad range of legal authority. So you want to look in your project partnerships, who's got the most advanced and high-tech financial system. Today, it must be EFT, electronic funds transfer systems, and can administer those funds and manage the audits that are required annually for the life of the project.
Those are all really good points, Don. And especially, I know a lot of our partners at TPMA, I mean, we work with regions, we work with small rural communities, we work with nonprofits. And so you really did touch on some good things there that I think are applicable to a number of our audience members. So, moving on to a little bit more of a, idea generation question. So the Economic Development Administration yesterday finally came out with their notice of funding, $3 billion that they were given as a part of the latest American Rescue Plan fund way back in March. Guidance just came out, but we'll take it. So, I know that a lot of people, when they see big dollar signs like that, they get intimidated, they get nervous, they don't know how to create that local match. And so, grant funding, going after federal grants, I realize that ARP is intimidating to people, but really federal funds are federal funds, state funds are state funds. These rules and regulations really haven't changed. If anything, they've actually gotten a little bit more loose. Can you all talk a little bit about maybe an example that you have seen throughout your career of a good braided funding project that might kind of give our audience some additional, inspiration for what right might look like.
Yeah, I can take a stab at this first, Dawn. So, an example that I think comes to mind for me is, in my neck of the woods, our county redevelopment authority is very adept at identifying a multitude of federal sources to claim vacant buildings, put them back into productive reuse. And they draw from a number of funding sources. They draw from the EDA for funding, the Appalachian Regional Commission, the EPA. Some of these properties often require, brownfield remediation, so they're able to draw from the EPA to take care of some of that pre-development work. The USDA provides funding for rural communities to do capital projects and redevelopment projects. So, and in addition, they have their own sources of funds, proceeds from the revolving loan fund that they're able to plow back into other projects. So for me, it goes back to, again, they have the legal authority to do this. They have the financial expertise to put the dollars to good use. And then again, they have that strong back office component where they're able to track, report, monitor, and meet the requirements of the agencies who are providing the funding.
Great,
so an example I'd love to share is a perfect model, and it was from back in the early 2007 year. We did 2 state, regional, and workforce and higher education project, and it was called the One KC Wired project, where we took 2 states, 1 metropolitan area, 4 workforce boards, 4 community colleges, and they all came together with federal, state, and local dollars and created this one marketing niche around their high demand occupations and their high demand industries in that metropolitan area, where the colleges provided quick in-demand job training programs of study. The workforce boards provided the recruitment of the students to those studies, and the employers and the economic development councils were working with the employers to make sure they were there to hire them. And so they really branded themselves as a regional economic metro area where all 3 partners worked together, and we had state, federal, and local dollars. And they branded themselves as the One KC Wired, and it was very successful.
It was very successful, Dawn. Actually, I don't know if I've ever told you this. I was an economic development director in the Kansas City metropolitan area when that came out. And I remember KCADC, the Kansas City Area Development Council, doing a giant unveiling and dog and pony show. And it was a big deal. So that is a great example. Another great example is one that Dr. Joanna Anderson, I think, is going to present to you all today. This part of the reason that we had her join our group. And so I'm really excited to learn just a little bit more about her project and why it's such a great example of how you can braid funds together. So Dr. Anderson, I will turn things over to you.
Well, we are a community college located in Sedalia, Missouri. So just a little context for us. We have an annual fall headcount enrollment credit count of about 4,000 students. And we're fairly rural. We have a 14 county service region, but primarily a 2-county taxing district. We developed a campus master plan back in 2015 that identified we needed more building space to have programs for advanced manufacturing and to expand both welding technology and precision machining. We have a large manufacturing base here in Sedalia and Pettis County. And so those occupations are high demand. There's just not enough skilled workers in those areas. And so the first thing we tried was one source, which was a GEO-bond. And so we put that out for voters in 2017. And unfortunately, it got a majority, but not the 4/7 required here in Missouri. And that was called Building Strong Futures. So we had a plan. It didn't pass. So we were like, okay, now what are we going to do? So what our current project is, we scaled it back, but we are currently under construction for a $7 to $10 million facility that will be able to double capacity for our training in welding and precision machining, free up lab spaces for advanced manufacturing, for facility management and other programs that those current labs are teaching out of. So that's kind of what the project is. When the terminology you mentioned, braided funding, we just call it finding ways to get money to do a project. So I love the new fancy terminology. But basically, our college has done that for a really long time. We're over 50 years old, but except for the initial passage by our voters to establish the college in a levy, we have never passed a bond or a financing mechanism. So we've always had to put things together with donors, with federal sources, with state and local support that could create a project. So our current project includes, there's multiple kinds of funding going into it. The first thing was, though, we had a donor who came forward and wanted to give a named gift opportunity. So that was really fortunate. And about the same time, we knew that there was an opportunity to apply for a community development block grant. Those are federal funds that flow through the state, and you have to meet certain criteria in order to get those. And then the programming that goes on has to be for low income so that you're moving people out of poverty and getting them good paying jobs. And so we were able to receive a grant from the state for the workforce initiative of $500,000 for that community development block grant. And then at the same time, we have a really strong foundation here at the college, and the foundation applied for neighborhood assistance program tax credits. It's the first time our college has participated in NAP credits, and so that was kind of a new realm for us to be in. They are able to sell $500,000 of tax credits, and so they're well on their way of that. And then we also then, one of the things you talked about in addition to trust and partnerships, and it goes along with both of those things, is just having good relationships with legislators, with leaders in your state, and people who can see if there's an opportunity that funding might be available for a project, can put your name in to get that. And so in this last round, and it's was passed with our House Bill 19, State Fair Community College is getting $2 million from state funding, which is kind of the first time for a capital project like this. Generally, community colleges, we don't get a lot of state money for capital projects here in Missouri. So we're really fortunate. There were several others that were funded for some capital project money, but that came about because of our relationship with local legislators, also with our governor, knowing that we do provide workforce development that's really much needed. And so we were able to get that $2 million. We had already raised the match for that. And so it was an easy ask, I guess. And we're really very fortunate. So out of our $10 million campaign, we are about $6 million in, which we're really very fortunate with. And then one other type of funding, our state, because they've been focused on workforce heavily with, especially under the leadership of Governor Parson, there have been Mo Excel grants. That's what they're called. We kind of have Mo things here happening in Missouri. And so we had submitted for our advanced Center for Excellence in Advanced Manufacturing. And prior to the pandemic, we were in the budget for half of that in the first round, which would have been in this FY21 budget. Well, then we all know what happened with COVID. That funding didn't go through. And so it has now been approved for this FY22 budget. So we are able to get $2.4 million with a Mo Excel's budget, which is half of our 4.8 ask. which will go toward this Center for Excellence in Advanced Manufacturing. Some of that can be capital to finish out the precision machining side. Some of it will go to renovations in the current labs and then also to equipment. And then finally, there are Perkins dollars that are going to be able to provide the new equipment in this facility. But, you know, it is like Don and Brett have said, it's finding a lot of different ways to pull monies together. And I just kind of want to conclude by saying what you mentioned in having, Don, your workforce partners come together. We had a meeting this week that brought our area manufacturing partners in to really help them undergird this Center for Excellence and get their input into what is a Center for Excellence, so we can make sure we've got all the cogs and the wheels in place for that once our new facility is done, which we hope to have a ribbon cutting for next spring. So we'll be teaching classes in that new facility next fall, a year from this fall. So I would answer any questions you have. As you can imagine, there's a lot of tracking that's required for all of those different pieces. The community development block grant, basically, we would get those funds as we expended them on the college side. The NAP credit monies, we don't get until we've sold all of the NAP credits. So that piece will be a little lingering. And then, you know, there's just a lot of accounting. So we have a person dedicated to making sure that all of these grants that we're getting or any tracking of federal or state dollars, that we can give a clear accounting of that.
Yeah, that is a full-time position in and of itself. Yeah. So I do want to just let our audience members know if you have a question for Dr. Anderson related to this project, definitely feel free to put it into the chat. I also want to ask you, Dr. Anderson, one of the things that you hit on a few times, you mentioned philanthropic partners. And so, you know, when you're looking at a $10 million bucket, at what point do you go to those philanthropic partners? I mean, do you start with them and say, how much are you willing to give, and then figure out how much you need to get from state and local and federal government? Or what does that process look like for filling that bucket the whole way?
Yeah, well, some institutions go about it in a different way, but basically we had the plan of what we needed to achieve for the space and the program. So we looked at it from a programmatic view of saying, this is what we need to provide the workforce that's in demand and to free up other labs and spaces. So we knew that cost we had. So we began the construction plans of that facility. We knew we had a named gift opportunity that had been kind of in the wings. Mm-hmm. So developing those relationships with individuals who want to give to your institution, one, they do that because they see that you are having a direct impact on the community that they live in and work and love. And then it's also just, you know, in this case, the family was very much workforce oriented. That individual served on our foundation and they wanted to honor their father. And it's a great, great story to have. So if you have those individuals, then you kind of know what their level of giving potentially can be. But other than that, we just said we've got great partners. Because this is definitely geared at workforce, we have had our manufacturers also come forward. So I just want to give a shout out to, we've had Gardner in Denver who's here, and they've given a named classroom. We have Wireco World Group Company, and they have given a gift for a classroom. And then we have Nucor Steel, which is a new company to Sedalia, but they have donated all of the steel and are going to have a classroom named. And then we have other named opportunities. But, you know, it's you may want to go do a feasibility study and see what your capital resources can be. We didn't do that because we looked at it from a project of this is what we need, and we're going to go find the funds. In the meantime, we also borrowed money. And honestly, that was kind of the most challenging part because there's so many moving parts to this that finding a funder that was a bank, basically, that was really comfortable, that was more difficult than we thought it might be. Partly, I think, coming out of the pandemic. But we did find a bank who wanted to loan us the money so that we could get all this done, because the foundation, we had to do a lease back because of those NAP tax credits go through the foundation. So it can get complicated, but you just have to keep working at it and get it done. Yeah.
It sounds like you were not afraid to roll up your sleeves. So before I head to the next question, I do just want to ask Don and Brett, if you're looking at kind of putting together a strategy for filling up those buckets, do either one of you have any recommendations for our audience as far as like what to tackle first?
I would start with a partnership agreement, and that just sets out the rules, the communication levels, and the expectations of the project, so there's no misunderstandings. When state agencies engage in Braided funded projects, for example, the new Indiana Career Explorer, which is being funded by 5 state agencies. I think it's the Governor's Workforce Council, the Family and Social Services Department, the Commission of Higher Ed, the Department of Education, and the Department of Workforce Development. They have an interagency agreement, how they are all coming together and how the project, who's responsible, which portions of the project, who will serve as the lead fiduciary agent. So I think an interagency agreement or a memorandum of understanding with all the partners together. And so the expectations are set up front. The bar is set up front of how often you're going to meet, what the communication is, what are your success metrics look like. And then you have also in that a place and a safe space to talk about, audits and monitoring of those funds.
That's a huge piece. I don't think people really think about that auditing and monitoring piece up at the front, and then the back end. It's like, oh, we didn't budget for that. So kind of important to remember from the beginning. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, so that's a perfect answer from Dawn. That's a tough one to top because I wouldn't have thought of that, right? I think she nailed that. I was thinking a little differently. I think a business plan, right? A business plan with detailed pro formas and projections. I would also say some rough source and use of funds to start to understand what pieces are in place. And then I would even add on one more thing. If you're going to try to attract perhaps philanthropic dollars, I would encourage you to do some type of impact analysis, right? Demonstrate the potential return on investor for those philanthropic investors or charitable capital sources, so that you can show the positive economic or community impact that the project or program will have for the community. So.
Yeah, can I just add to that?
Absolutely, yeah.
That's a really key point, because we have been putting out applications to foundations, and they definitely want to know how many jobs, how many students are you going to train? What kind of jobs? What's the salaries that they are going to get? Because there are many philanthropic organizations, they want to help individuals move out of poverty into good paying jobs. And so that impact analysis is really important. That's one of the things we went through, and we have been able to get some foundation grants as well. So good recommendation. And, often you think, oh, these partners, they're all going to just get along and things are going to go well. But when you don't meet a metrics or things just don't go as planned, Dawn, you're so right. It's so good to have that agreement up front, and then a contingency, to talk about as well, so that those partners are really cohesive. You can go back to that agreement and say, well, here's what we agreed to, and here's how we're moving forward. We haven't done anything quite that complicated.
So, in the years of the TAC grants, the round 1 TAC grants, there were 22 consortium grants awarded in the nation. So by creating that executive advisory board, it's one grant award that comes out to multiple partners, but the performance metrics are all rolled up into one. So if you have a partner that cannot expend those same funds, they're a portion of the funds, therefore they're not filling that piece of performance metric towards the project, that oversight board can be a safe space to say, okay, let's put the balance of this money to the partners who are meeting their performance metrics, and let them compete for the balance of the funding. Therefore, the consortium, it's a win-win for all. But understanding that and having those civility, rules in place, when the projects start, makes it easier for all partners. And then, going into long-term projects like a 4 or 5 year project, life happens, leaders come and go to the table, but recognizing each new leader that comes to that table comes with gifts.
I like that term, gifts, Dawn. That sounds.
Share the love.
Yes. No, I love that. So, there's been a few little comments that I've heard throughout the course of some of your responses that maybe sometimes these don't always go well. So I do want to ask you, what happens? I mean, Dr. Anderson, it sounds like you in particular, you have no problems getting your sleeves rolled up and going to work. But what happens when you do hit those roadblocks along the way?
Well, and we've had some roadblocks, just not on this project yet. I think and leaders, Dawn made a really good point. Leadership, even of the projects, comes and goes, and you could have a big change midstream. It's just making sure that you go back to why was this project important to begin with? So if you can refocus on the values that project is going to add, why did we go into this? Because sometimes, things can get at a point where you just have to be reminded of why you started this whole thing in the first place. Get refocused and then bring people up to speed. Sometimes it means that you've got to do research, get a bigger understanding of what's happening, and then reach out to those resources and those partners that you've had to bring their creative thoughts to the table as well. Because as Dawn said, we all have gifts, and somebody may have a really good idea on how to solve the dilemma that you're facing. But I think refocusing on what the goals of that project is all about gets people back working again and in a good order, hopefully.
Yes. So, I've seen some communities go so far as actually creating matching funds pots within their community, where that's all they are using that money for, is for matching funds for grant programs, whether it be for local philanthropic organizations or education institutions, the whole nine yards. So not everybody, unfortunately, is in a community that necessarily thinks collaboratively just from the get-go. How do you work together to get that philanthropic mindset, or that collaborative mindset, I guess is a better way of putting it? What are the starting points that you even put into place to get those projects off the ground?
I'll take a quick stab at this first here. So I think getting the right people at the table, creating a forum with consistent communication is a key step. What I've seen work is, a collective economic development system, taking inventory of high potential projects, projects that are deemed potentially transformational for the community, taking inventory of those projects, cataloging those projects, and then understanding what sources are already available, and then beginning to anticipate potential future sources, understanding funding cycles, and essentially being prepared to go out to the agency at the right time with the right ask, with the right information, I think positions folks in a way that they're more likely to be successful in procuring those funds.
I can't tell you what good advice that is. Real quick, Dawn, before we head to you, so many of you may or may not know that TPMA is headquartered in Indiana, which is the land that our owner affectionately refers to as having a third government, which is the Lilly Endowment. So there are a lot of unknown opportunities that just kind of come at a time that you're maybe not expecting. So having that inventory and that wish list, especially for communities in particular, I think that's excellent advice, Brett. I mean, that way when opportunity is there, you can strike. So go ahead, Dawn.
I would just add, in the Show Me State, Missouri, which is where Dr. Anderson and I reside, We have a public-private organization, which is state funding and local organizations to support industries, economic development here in Missouri. And so those are great. And they're always looking for projects to support rural communities as well as our metro areas. In so much that with projects, making sure you create a buzz around your project and you keep it in front of the public, because new organizations are coming into these communities and they want to be part of that group that's making a positive impact to their communities. So there's so many free media outlets that you can create that buzz around. Community business journals, the newspaper, the local TV stations are always looking for newsworthy events and stories. And so as your project attains its first performance metrics of successes, keep that buzz going within the community, because then more partners want to come on board to the project and it grows and ends up sustaining itself.
Can I add on to that a little bit?
Yeah.
Keep the projects in front of your elected officials as well. The elected officials, when they're going through budget sessions at the local level or the state level, you want to make sure that they understand the funding that you need for this particular project. Your federal officials too, when they're on the Hill, you want them to know about what's important in your community, the projects that are important to the economic development, community development professionals, and the community as a whole. So I think consistent communication with your elected officials will benefit you, and they also appreciate that as well. So I think that's a group you definitely want to keep engaged.
Yeah.
In a previous economic development director role, Brett, I used to do that. Every single project that I had kind of outlined throughout the course of the next year, I budgeted for my match. I didn't always get it, but if I knew that I needed $250,000 for an EDA grant match, I was asking for it. So, and believe it or not, I actually did get it most often. So go ahead, Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, I was just I'm actually going to put a plug in for TPMA here, because we worked with Don to write a grant for a federal rural healthcare initiative. And, we knew it might be kind of a long shot, but we are known for our excellent healthcare programs here at State Fair Community College. So we wrote that grant. Unfortunately, we didn't get it. It was a good grant, right, Dawn?
It was.
To go back to your point, what do you need to do? Sometimes you need to have these projects planned out, thought out, written, because another opportunity may become available. And for example, we are now getting a Gear Excels grant through the Missouri Department of Higher and Economic Development or Workforce Development to fund a piece of that grant that Don, we worked together on writing for a surgical tech program. And so while we didn't get the initial one, it was sitting there, all of the work had been done, and so it could just be repurposed quickly. I think sometimes we don't realize the value of those already pre-planned projects, and we're kind of down if we don't get them, but there's always an opportunity that's coming along next that those you can just plug into. And I can say that that's kind of the first time we actually had one on a shelf, and it was really nice to be able to just pull that off and use it going forward.
That is such a good point, Dr. Anderson. One of the other things that I think we haven't necessarily hit on just yet is that, when we talk about braiding funds for a particular project, a piece of that could be paying for smaller segments of that project, even on a different timeline. I'm just going to throw out for our audience, I know that we haven't gotten any questions about ARP funding in particular, or any questions. I want to point out to our audience, if you have questions, feel free to ask. But ARP funding in particular seems to just be this really scary gray area. And I want to just make sure that our audience members know that pieces of ARP funds can be used for things that are related to federal programs. And I'm just going to give an example. We had a client call us the other day that was asking about this new EDA funding that had come out and asking, can we use our ARP funds as a match toward the EDA program? Well, you can't use federal funds to go to another federal program, but what you can do is you can get the preliminary engineer drawings done for maybe if it's like a sewer project, like it happened to be with this client, you can have the site work done. You can have the environmental testing done. So you can use ARP funding to get some of the preliminary legwork on a particular project done, assuming that it matches the federal guidelines for the American Rescue Plan Fund, which are very broad. So, you can use that money in a really creative way to create some foundational work that then might allow you to get a little bit further on your actual project and still be eligible for federal funding.
Right. Yeah, we were in Iowa last month in June at Des Moines Community College with 139 workforce board directors, chief elected county officials, other community college presidents around the state, and talking about how braided funding using ARP funding, because it's coming from the federal, it's coming from to the states, and it's also already some of it's gone to the local county offices, and workforce development there with their economic development councils, their workforce boards, their chamber of commerce's, the state, it's their number one priority. What can we do to make an impact with workforce development and skilling up our displaced workers from the pandemic? And so we provided examples of how that braided funding could work. And if it's a priority in your county, then partner with your community college, partner with your local American Job Center, your workforce board, your economic development council, your chamber of commerce, and the project will then come to fruition. But you're right, you do need to have a design done, a logic model and a design of what that project will do, what will be the return on investment to that community, how many jobs will it ultimately create and fill, how many people will it remove off of public assistance as well.
Absolutely. Well, and I think when we have an opportunity like this too, like with ARP, where the guidance is purposely written very, very broad. I think this was a comment that was said at the very beginning of the webinar where, the government wants to see this money implemented. They want to see it spent. So I think that this is a rare occurrence where they're actually encouraging creativity in the way that those funds are administered. I don't think that the Treasury wants to see any of those dollars returned. So, yeah. Well, so we are coming up on an hour. Before we officially wrap things up, I do want to just go around to our audience or to our panelists and ask, oftentimes during webinars, somebody else says something and you're like, yes, that's a great point, and you want to kind of expand on that. Do you all have any maybe final recommendations for our audience or areas that you maybe want to expand upon a little bit? And since you kicked things off, Dawn, I'll go ahead and let you close things out if you don't mind. Yep.
And mine's going to stem from where I started with workforce development and higher ed is economic development. And this goes back to one of my very first and favorite projects when I was in Illinois. And it was to build an enterprise zone, but a commercial gateway commerce industrial park in a flood zone. And what it required legislatively in the 2 years of building that. Now, every day when I drive home to my parents on 270, and I look over at that and I think I was part of that project, but hang in there and stay with it and don't lose sight of the impact, because the jobs that were created, the small businesses, that the entrepreneurship just blossomed there for the tier 1, 2, and 3 suppliers to those jobs, whether it be a mom and pop pizza parlor or a gas station, a C-store. It did wonders for a blighted community. It took time. It took a lot of resources. It took a lot of leadership. And we all come to the table as leaders with those gifts, but hang in there and your community will benefit ultimately.
Thanks, Dawn. No, that's a really good point. And yes, the time piece is a great point. The expectations of how long these projects take, I think for those of us who are in this world, we understand, but maybe not always for the folks out there in the community. How about you, Brett? Any closing thoughts or comments for the group?
Yeah, so 2 words. 1, preparation. I think take inventory of the projects that you believe will make a positive impact on the community. Understand the tools that are out there and available to you. Try to understand them the best you can, which leads into my next word, partnerships. Reach out to the agencies, reach out to the funders directly, ask them questions, pick their brains on how the funds work, what the reporting requirements are, et cetera. So I would say preparation and partnership.
And I don't want to say that Dr. Anderson is going to say tenacity, but if I had to describe you, that is exactly what I would say. But Dr. Anderson, what are your closing thoughts and comments?
Well, we can use that word. It's a good one. We are small and we are lean, so we don't always have the internal resources. And sometimes it's kind of hard to part with resource dollars to give to people who are professionals in that. But that is one of the things, honestly, we haven't talked about. But I think if you're small and lean and you don't have the internal resources, then go find somebody who can help you. You may have to pay some for that. Yeah, absolutely. And you didn't pay me to say that, but it's true for us.
Check is in the mail. No, I'm just teasing.
So that's really important. And then the last one is just relationship building with your legislators, with local folks, with your business and industry, because these are all about helping our communities thrive, helping individuals grow and reach their personal goals as well. So they're worthwhile projects. You just got to keep after it.
Awesome. Okay. Well, this has been fantastic. I don't know how much our audience learned, but I certainly learned a lot. I really, really appreciate you all coming and sharing not only your expertise, but your hands-on and in-depth experience, especially for you, Dr. Anderson. I do just want to remind the members of our audience that we put all of our webinars on the TPMA YouTube channel. There is a link to that on our website if you cannot find it. And then finally, if you missed the opportunity to ask any of our panelists questions during the webinar, you can be sure and shoot us an email and we will make sure that we get that over to the appropriate person. So again, I want to thank you for joining us here today, and hopefully maybe we can help some people get some money in their project. So appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.